going to happen, or whether your thinking has evolved. It almost sounded like you wanted to separate Bitcoin from the rest of the industry. And I'm wondering whether you're actually warming to the idea of at least Bitcoin, and whether again people are tweeting you that I said you either stood in the way of an extraordinary industry or were utterly unable to prevent a massive bubble. What do you think the future holds? Do you have a feeling on which it is? Do you think Bitcoin has inherent value and is a store of value? Or do you feel that when we look back on it 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be something from the 18th century with tulips?
Joe, it's hard to predict. I think I really do like you, because I know that you think I'm going to out you, think negatively on many of these altcoins. You, Joe. But
right.
in terms of Bitcoin, we at the SEC have never said it's a security.
Well,
I have not.
What do you think? You taught at MIT. I think you know. You got to have some kind of feeling. You've read the books, Bitcoin Standard.
Yeah. I think that Bitcoin is a highly speculative, volatile asset, but with 7 billion people around the globe. 7 billion people want to trade it, just like we do have gold for 10,000 years. We have Bitcoin. It might be something else in the future as well. Right. These other thousands of projects need to show their use case and show that they actually have fundamentals underlying them, or they won't persist, Joe.
Oh, my God, you own Bitcoin.
That's where the public... That's why the public needs disclosure.
That's what it's.
You love it. You
love it. You don't like those other coins.
I've never owned any of these, and I've been consistent for 7 or 8 years on this.
Well, now you can't, because you won't be at SEC chair.
Happy Bitcoin Wednesday, freaks. It's your host, Odell, here for another Citadel Dispatch, the interactive live show focused on actionable Bitcoin and freedom tech discussion. I'm broadcasting live from an undisclosed location because we have a very timely topic to bring to you, freaks. That intro was our boy Joe Kernan, who runs the #1 Bitcoin podcast in the world, Squawk Box on CNBC, roasting outgoing SEC chair Gary Gensler. Our topic today is the upcoming Trump administration, the regulatory outlook, how policy is shaping up, and what that means for Bitcoiners, both in America and around the world. I'm joined here by a good friend and head of policy at Bitcoin Policy Institute, Zack Shapiro. Bitcoin Policy Institute is one of the leading think tanks advising the upcoming Trump administration and other policymakers. They also have a P2P Rights subgroup that Zack is executive director of. So how's it going, Zack? Good to have you here.
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
This is crazy times where I guess we're about a week away from the upcoming presidency. We have there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement about what could be our first Bitcoin president. And there's a lot of concern about whether or not people that appreciate using Bitcoin as freedom money, are concerned what it might mean for them going forward. So how are you thinking about what comes next?
Yeah, for sure. So my overall reaction to the what we've heard from the Trump administration and from the incoming Congress is in many ways a huge sigh of relief compared to what would have been if the election had gone the other way. I don't see the sort of mainstream adoption of Bitcoin, including by Wall Street, including by governments, as at odds with the mission of Bitcoin as freedom money. I think these are very both important, themes in Bitcoin. It's monetization. It's going from being seen as an illegitimate asset or a hobby or a tool for money laundering into an important regulated financial system. Especially in the West, but then in other parts of the world, especially in the global South, a sort of vital means of resisting authoritarianism, of using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange and as freedom money in every sense you could mean.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to break down here. So you've been active in this space for a while now. If you were compared to where we stand today versus, let's say, 6 months ago or a year ago, how would you compare and contrast, current developments?
I think it's night and day. So I think there are different sort of buckets we can look at. So starting with the government, if you look at each of the three branches of the federal government, the biggest change we're going to see definitely is with the executive branch. If you look at the way that the Biden administration looked at Bitcoin and crypto writ large, just Bitcoin, multiple parts of the government seem to be all out attacking. If the SEC, the biggest news for Bitcoin SEC in 2024 was the approval of spot Bitcoin ETFs, which seems like it's had a pretty big impact on the price and sort of on the broad perception from people outside the community, Wall Street. The approval of the Bitcoin ETF took a lawsuit against the SEC. It involved Gary Gensler writing sort of the saltiest ever concurrence on the decision to grant the spot ETF. There's no in-kind creation and redemption. They slow-rolled options. The SEC in general, and then aside from the ETF, SAB 121 prohibited banks from holding Bitcoin as collateral. Totally sort of anti-Bitcoin policy. If you look at the IRS, we just had sort of a midnight surprise from the Biden IRS, where they're saying that anyone who creates software that facilitates people's trading, including in Bitcoin, could be seen as a broker. And if they're in a position to KYC, they have to KYC to be able to report trades to the government, even if you're just a front end, for example, for a Taproot swap on the back end, or potentially an eCashment, or any kind of non-custodial tool. If you look at the DOJ and Treasury, the DOJ launched these actions against Tornado Cash and Samurai, directly going after developers of non-custodial tools. The Treasury has not come out with guidance that's helpful there. The Treasury, through its OFAC office, sanctioned the smart contracts for Tornado Cash, which are just code that's running on the internet. We were really sort of in a defensive posture when they had the infrastructure bill. They tried to sneak in redefinitions of brokers that would include almost everyone in the Bitcoin industry. And so going from that to having a president that bought burgers over the Lightning Network at PubKey, that's appointing not just pro Bitcoin people in terms of their stance, but people that in many cases understand and hold Bitcoin into really key roles across the administration up to the cabinet level. That's really night and day. And I think a lot of the change in the executive branch is something that's just going to happen naturally because of the personnel shift. A lot of the key personnel who oversaw Bitcoin-related issues in the Biden administration were handpicked by Elizabeth Warren, who really wants Bitcoin to die. That's one of her sort of key missions, and she's going to be replaced by people who got to where they got in part by being supportive. And I think both through executive orders coming through the White House and just through different decision making at these different executive agencies, we're going to see a huge, if not overnight, pretty rapid difference in the way the government approaches Bitcoin from the executive branch. In the Congress, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag there. We're pushing really hard to help people understand Senator Lummis's Bitcoin Act bill, which would create a strategic Bitcoin reserve and buy 1 million coins. We're going to definitely help draft language where appropriate for other legislation that we think are really important for Bitcoin related priorities, whether those are accounting, whether those are protections for developers, whether that's fair treatment for minors. There's lots of opportunity there, but we are more competing with legislative priorities in Congress from other interests in the crypto space. So, for example, the SBR bill is one of the potential sort of marquee crypto-related bills that could go through Congress, but there's also a stablecoin legislation that I think TradFi is really interested in, so they can enter the space and get the legislative clarity they need to create JP Morgan coin or BlackRock coin or whatever they're trying to do to compete with Tether. And then, the market structure bill, which is really important to the crypto exchanges, really important to the crypto VCs to sort out which token launches constitute securities offerings, which don't, and create a safe harbor for people who want to do VC token launches. And there's a lot of money and interest behind all of these. So Congress, I think, is poised to be friendlier to Bitcoin than they have in a while. But the question is, like, where do we rank in their priorities? And then the judicial branch, judges are more insulated at the federal level from politics. They have lifetime appointments. And that's where I think there's still the most work left to do. I'm sure we'll talk more about the P2P Rights Fund, which is a nonprofit litigation fund meant specifically to get involved with the federal courts where the rights of developers and individuals to transact on a peer-to-peer basis are in jeopardy. But I think that's where the election is going to have the least impact going forward. And then it's worth mentioning also sort of traditional finance looks at Bitcoin so differently, I think, right now than they did a year ago. I think the career risk around being involved in Bitcoin, around investing in Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin, recommending Bitcoin is just in such a different place. It's seen so much more legitimately than it was even 1 year ago. And a lot of that is just about the number go upside. But I think there are some positive externalities for Bitcoin as freedom money and Bitcoin, the network. I think it could bring people into the developer space. I think it could, open people's minds to self-custody as opposed to just holding ETFs. And that shift in the Overton window coming from the private sector, I think, is a real ingredient, both in its own in terms of how people writ large think about Bitcoin in the United States and abroad, but also it could have a ricochet effect on how the government thinks about and deals with Bitcoin.
Awesome. Huge shout out to the live chat. I apologize about the echo. I think I solved it. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, to our attention. And huge shout out to Mab21, who zapped 10,000 sats. To those watching on YouTube or Twitch, the nostr live chat can be found at zap.stream/Odell. So Zach, I mean, there was a lot there. So I'm trying to think where I want to go first with this. Do you think there's a concern? Is there a real concern? I've heard a lot of people voice this. Is there a real concern about this idea that most Bitcoin will be used in like an ETF type of situation or a custodial type of situation, a custodial regulated type of situation, while self-custody will continue to be pushed down on? Like, how do you think about people's ability to freely use Bitcoin in a self-custody, freedom-oriented fashion going forward?
Yeah, I would separate those two things out. I think it is true that we are likely to see more Bitcoin as a proportion of the network end up in custodial products. I think that is a function of people starting to understand Bitcoin, the asset, and wanting to hold it in what they see as less risky ways. These are people who are not necessarily going to understand how to self-custody, feel okay self-custodying. And the truth is, I don't know how much there is we can do about people making that decision. And I expect that secular trend to continue to some extent. I don't think it necessarily, at least the way it's happening now, comes at the cost of using Bitcoin, the network, and Bitcoin as freedom money. I think, there are a couple of ways you could take this. One is, all right, as Bitcoin becomes more integrated into Wall Street, and then especially if we get something like a strategic Bitcoin reserve and Bitcoin becomes an important asset to governments like the United States government, how does that impact freedom money? And there's definitely some narratives out there that could be an attack on Bitcoin, that this is really not in our interest to support this decision making. I totally disagree with that. We sort of started this chat about how different things are from a year ago. I think in most of those ways, things are moving in a positive direction for people who hold Bitcoin in the United States and people who are building Bitcoin businesses and developing Bitcoin tools. I think the risk goes down as incentives are aligned. And I think that's not just true in the positive sense, that if the United States government sees Bitcoin as an important asset, they're more likely to protect Bitcoiners and people building on Bitcoin. I think the converse is also true, that if the United States government doesn't embrace Bitcoin, the game theory is that our adversaries will. I think ever since 2022, with the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen countries react to the United States freezing Russia's treasuries reserves by buying gold and selling treasuries. And I think sort of the game is up, that U.S. treasuries are a neutral reserve asset, right? That are sort of like a commodity. No, they're printed and controlled by a country that has its own monetary policy and has its own sanctions policy. And gold does not work that way. Bitcoin is just better than gold if you're trying to hold a neutral reserve asset. There are some countries we've seen come out and say that. I've heard, I think, many of the same rumors that you probably have, that there are other, perhaps bigger countries that are accumulating Bitcoin, mining Bitcoin, that aren't talking about it publicly. And if it's not the case now, I'm quite confident it will be the case that the countries that are stacking Bitcoin will include our adversaries. And if those countries were to come out, if Russia or China or Iran were to come out and say, hey, we're mining Bitcoin, we're holding Bitcoin, and the United States is not, I think the consequences in terms of the policy response from the United States for Bitcoiners and for Bitcoin developers is likely to be very severe. And so aside from aligning incentives and improving education for the United States government by creating a Bitcoin reserve, especially a Bitcoin reserve in self-custody in the United States, just the ability to avoid this sort of geopolitical time bomb of our adversaries coming out as pro-Bitcoin or holding Bitcoin, and then having a negative, perhaps bipartisan reaction is really important. And so these things are rowing in the same direction and not sort of at odds with one another.
Awesome. I mean, so first of all, before we continue, I probably should disclose that I'm one of the founding board members of Bitcoin Policy Institute. There's 3 of us. I do not get paid for that role, and it's more of a support role, really. David Zell and Grant McCarthy are incredibly impressive individuals, and they run the operation. So where I want to go here is, so on that note, you did mention the Tornado Cash and Samurai cases. I'm kind of curious on your opinion here of where those stand or how you think about them going forward.
Yeah. So given that you mentioned BPI, let me give you a little bit of background about how sort of we think about policy issues. So BPI is not a lobbying organization. It's a think tank. We definitely have policy preferences, and there may be times in the future where we get more directly involved in lobbying. But our goal is to really think deeply about what should good policy around Bitcoin be in the broadest sense possible, and then to educate relevant policymakers about what good policy should look like, and draft bills, draft executive orders, and get involved where we can to help affect that policy. Our only client, our only real constituent, is the Bitcoin network. Now, there are many different types of people that are part of the Bitcoin network. It could be individual Bitcoin holders, it could be node runners, it could be miners, it could be developers, and so we are sort of looking out. And there are other important roles, right? Developers obviously do their own thing that's incredibly important, but we think policy has a role here. And so, we want to do what is in the best interest of Bitcoin vis-a-vis, especially US federal policy. The P2P Rights Fund started this year in April in reaction to 2 things that happened in the span, I think, of 1 week that were just incredibly concerning to me. The first was the prosecution against Samurai Wallet that included charging the developers of Samurai Wallet with being unlicensed money transmitters, essentially for writing and supporting code that allowed people to spend their own Bitcoin in a private way. When, in my view, as a legal matter, they were not transmitting anyone's money. People were using Samurai Wallet to transmit their own money, and this was something the government was either negligently or intentionally conflating in order to prosecute these individuals. And then that same week, we got a reply brief in an earlier action, similar action that had been brought against the developers of Tornado Cash, which is a privacy tool on the Ethereum network, that really laid out for the first time in full the way the government thinks about, or the DOJ specifically thinks about what money transmission is in the context of non-custodial tools. And it has, had language in this brief that some of your listeners might remember from the time, saying that, listen, in the way that a frying pan transmits heat or a USB cable transmits data, a non-custodial tool can transmit funds, and that doesn't require actual custody or control of those funds. And right away, if you just think through what that means, you get to a really crazy and dark place. There's no limiting principle if you're talking about frying pans transmitting heat. If all it takes is you take some action that facilitates people's movement of their own money on a peer-to-peer basis, and now you're a money transmitter, well, everyone in the Bitcoin ecosystem is a money transmitter, right? Miners append transactions to the blockchain, they're money transmitters. Should miners have to KYC transactions? Is that even possible? Are we gonna have to change the code for mining, or is mining gonna be banned in the United States? If you run a node, or let's say you don't run a node, let's say you use Ledger Live software, you're new to self-custody and you're using a Ledger wallet and you're using Ledger Live and you're using their node. They are facilitating the broadcast of your transaction that you signed with your keys to the network. Does that mean that running a node on behalf of others is money transmission, and the only people who are going to be able to directly interact with Bitcoin are people who can spin up their own node? That seems like a real problem. And you can take this to really crazy places even outside of Bitcoin, right? If someone hands someone else cash in an envelope, is the timber company that cut down the tree that made the paper for the envelope that holds the cash a money transmitter and has to KYC anyone who makes an envelope out of their wood? Like, you really need to have some limiting principle here. And so aside from various unjust features you can point to in both the Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet prosecutions, the reason why we started the P2P Rights Fund is about the precedent that these cases set if they come out the wrong way. And so the broad mission of the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund is to get involved specifically in court actions, right? In court cases where the government or the prosecution or whoever is making a sort of category error between what is a regulated financial institution and what is just code that allows people to operate on a peer-to-peer basis. And one of the things that made Bitcoin succeed where the other protocols didn't is that Bitcoin really truly operates on a peer-to-peer basis, right? The idea of proof of work allows people to interact with each other in a trustless way without a trusted intermediary. And that just is a new concept for the law. And so there are some cases where people are sort of maliciously making this conflation to kill Bitcoin. I think that the easiest example of that is Elizabeth Warren's DAMLA bill, which redefines explicitly everyone in the Bitcoin space, including node runners and miners, as money transmitters in a way that she knows they can't comply with. There is what I think is sort of like bumbling conflation or motivated not looking into it, like the prosecutors in the Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash cases, where they're not so concerned about the collateral damage of the precedent they're setting, but they really do see money laundering using crypto as a problem. And so they're going to use whatever legal theory they think is best. And then there's the judges who are overseeing these cases and who are going to have to make these rulings, who I don't necessarily think have malicious intent at all. But the idea of what it means to do a peer-to-peer transaction, how that's different than, for example, using Venmo, is a really foreign concept. And so main BPI, the mission is to educate policymakers about what good Bitcoin policy is and help them make good decisions. Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund is just extending this to the judicial branch, which is increasingly where this battle is going to be fought. And it's where you can get bad policy overnight without any democratic input. If a federal judge decides something the wrong way, that can become law, and there's not much you can do about it. And so we need to educate judges. And so the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund, part of what we do is we help fund cases like the Samurai defense. We've raised about $1 million for that to make sure that they have the resources they need to fight this case and not fold and set bad precedent. We're going to be involved in cases by writing amicus briefs to help directly educate judges on how this stuff all works and what the law is. And then we're going to branch out, especially in 2025, into providing free or low cost regulatory advice to people who are building especially open source non-custodial tools in Bitcoin to help them navigate what is a pretty confusing regulatory environment. Right now, I know you asked specifically about these cases. Unfortunately, not much has changed in terms of the cases. We've gotten one actual substantive federal court ruling that was in the Tornado Cash case, and that was horrible. It went about as badly as you could imagine. The judge explicitly saying that the Bank Secrecy Act does not require control or custody to apply, that the smart contract system in Tornado Cash was money transmission, at least as the government alleges the facts, that this will have to be decided at trial, and that there aren't First Amendment protections for running the smart contracts like the Tornado Cash smart contracts. There was a subsequent good ruling about the OFAC sanctions against Tornado Cash, which is great and welcome news, but does not really help with the money transmitter issue, isn't as relevant in that case. And then we haven't had any substantive rulings yet in the Samurai Wallet case, but we've not had great signs so far. I think the Tornado Cash decision is going to make this difficult, and the defense counsel in Samurai Wallet tried to separate out their arguments to first deal with this money transmission issue before they get to the extraordinary amount of discovery they need to get through before trial. And the judge refused to do those things separately. The judge said, we're going to handle this all at once, which frankly is not like an amazing sign about how sympathetic the judge is to this issue. I would say, looking at the election, the one bright spot for these cases in particular, I guess there are two. One is, depending on who ends up at FinCEN, which is the part of Treasury that deals with illicit finance. So this is someone who's going to be a Trump appointee and work under Scott Bessent. That person could put out guidance that clarifies how FinCEN thinks about non-custodial tools. They did this twice in 2013 and 2019, and there have not been updates since 2019. And so it could be quite helpful in these cases if FinCEN comes out and gives useful guidance, which is definitely something that we are advocating for at BPI. The other thing that will change that could be helpful is the head federal prosecutor in New York, in the U.S. Attorney's Office here, called the Southern District of New York, which is bringing both the Tornado Cash and Samurai cases, is being swapped out for someone who is an advisor at a crypto VC fund and certainly understands at least what the words non-custodial means. And so, it probably doesn't mean that they'll drop those cases, but it might mean that they're more careful about what precedent they set for the whole industry.
Okay, great. I mean, thanks for the very deep breakdown there. I mean, it seems like, all things considered, it's a much more positive outlook than even just a few months ago. I would like to move towards, so one of the things that there's been a lot of excitement about is this idea of Trump doing things day one with his executive privilege. I don't know how much insight you have there, how involved you are on that side of things, but how are you thinking about that? Is it realistic to expect anything significant in, let's say, the first week or the first 2 weeks of a Trump presidency here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what we're talking about. I think there is broad consensus among everyone who's talked to Trump. There is going to be a lot of specifically day one executive orders. So yes, Trump will definitely try and take action as quickly as possible for a lot of his priorities. Now, Bitcoin specifically, that's a harder question, and I think no one other than Trump knows what he's going to do on day one or shortly thereafter. I mean, he's repeatedly promised to free Ross on day one. That is something that's absolutely within his power, and something that if the community feels strongly about, they should hold him to. But that is something he said he would do for what that's worth. There's been reporting recently that there are likely to be either day one or first week executive orders related to SAB 121, which is the SEC rule that basically prevents banks from holding Bitcoin, and that there may well be an executive order on debanking, perhaps shaking things up at the FDIC and trying to either investigate or remedy what happened with Operation Choke Point 2.0, which has been a real hindrance for Bitcoin startups. We also at BPI drafted, and it's been made public, at least in an early form, an executive order for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And we don't know if he's going to sign that right away. We're hoping he will. We think that is a good sort of first step towards an SBR. Our executive order is constrained by the sort of power that the president has as opposed to the Congress. And so we really tried to think through what is the most you could do by executive order that would be helpful in terms of an SBR. And we did three things. The first is sort of just the legal pronouncement of an SBR, that Bitcoin is a strategic asset for the United States. We actually got some flack around the language from Bitcoiners about it's a gold-like store of value asset. Really, that is not meant to have any specific legal effect. Just because something is said by the government to be a store of value asset doesn't mean it's not also a medium of exchange or freedom money or anything like that. It's just signaling why. There are a lot of people, if they hear about strategic Bitcoin reserve, they're just going to think that's crazy. It would be like Bitcoiners hearing we're going to have a strategic, Doge or XRP reserve. And it just sounds like stupid and corrupt and grifty. And explaining that, like, no, Bitcoin has fundamentals that in some way is like gold, really just is meant to situate why you would do a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the first place. So it pronounces that. That's part one. Part two is to move Bitcoin that is currently in the custody of the United States government to the strategic Bitcoin reserve if the government has final legal title to that Bitcoin. So there's been a lot in the news over the last week or so about what is going to happen to the Bitcoin the United States government has now, either from the Bitfinex hack or the Silk Road case. And it may well be that by the time Trump takes office, they'll have sold all of that, which if I were Trump, I would see as a challenge and one to be redressed. But we got exactly the type of order that our executive order references in the Silk Road case, where a judge said, listen, this Bitcoin belongs to the US government. It doesn't, we don't know who individual X is, and we're not going to give it to individual X. And so if the government hasn't sold that Bitcoin would be eligible for inclusion in the SBR. And so part two of our executive order transfers that Bitcoin to the SBR as sort of the seed. And I think there would be something poetic about, if Trump on day one both frees Ross and moves the seized Silk Road Bitcoin into a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's hard to imagine a more powerful sort of 1-2 signal of where Bitcoin is compared to where it has been in its relationship to the government. And then third, and this was the legally tricky part, we tried to think through, okay, what mechanism could Trump use by executive order without having to get buy-in from Congress in order to actually buy Bitcoin? And the best that we came up with is the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is essentially a slush fund for the Treasury Department that is meant to allow the Secretary of the Treasury, who's going to be Scott Bessent, to buy assets if he thinks it's in the interest of the long-term stability of the dollar. And the laws that allow for the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the ESF, allow the Secretary of the Treasury, it enumerates each of the things. It says you can buy gold, you can buy foreign exchange reserves or instruments, and then you can buy instruments of credit or securities. So gold is not going to fly. We can't make the digital gold analogy because at the time this was passed, there was the Gold Reserve Act, and gold meant something very different than, for example, silver. We thought about, okay, could Bitcoin be a foreign exchange instrument? The case law we found makes that a little bit difficult to argue because the sort of standard legal definitions of FX are instruments that are issued by foreign governments, not just adopted as legal tender like it is in El Salvador. You could use an instrument, a securities instrument, to stack Bitcoin through the ETFs, but that feels a little bit less neutral, and you're picking winners and you're holding ETF shares. And that really feels divorced from sort of the ethos of Bitcoin as freedom money, to have, the United States buy BlackRock shares that are custodied at Coinbase. But came up with this idea where, okay, instrument of credit is incredibly broad. So why couldn't the United States government buy an instrument of credit, essentially a bond that's payable in kind in Bitcoin that can be held in self-custody by the United States? And so, we have parts of the United States government in the executive order creating cryptographic standards to do geographically separated, multi-sig self-custody, and really sort of modeling, what is the best standards in terms of holding Bitcoin. And that's the way that the executive order takes care of that. And so we're very much hoping Trump will sign the SBR executive order. We have several other executive orders drafted, including stuff dealing with the P2P Rights Fund style issues. There are our top priorities and asks for the new administration are first, and by far the most important, to clarify that non-custodial tools are not subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, This is definitely something that between the DOJ and the Treasury, they can do. I don't think we need a new law. I think the Bank Secrecy Act, as it's currently written, it says you need to accept and then transmit funds on behalf of the public to be a money transmitter. That's just not what self-custody is. But it would be good for the government to clarify that. And then for custodial businesses where you are going to custody funds, currently it's a nightmare to get licensed as a money transmitter, right? Some of the best Bitcoin exchanges like River are not available in New York City because of the bit license. If you're going to do any kind of like custodial Lightning startup right now, my day job is I work with a law firm. I run a law firm that works with Bitcoin startups, and we help deal with these issues for clients. If you're going to be a money transmitter, you're sometimes spending well over $1 million to get 50 state licenses. You have a huge compliance overhead, and it sucks. And streamlining that process would be really helpful for custodial tools. And so I think that's a little bit of a heavier lift than clarifying the Bank Secrecy Act. Doesn't apply to non-custodial tools, but I think there's a lot we can do there.
So to be clear, there's an executive order drafted that clarifies that the Bank Secrecy Act does not cover self-custody tools.
Drafted by us, not drafted by the Trump team, but yes.
And so then it's just an open question on whether or not he actually signs it, though.
Yes.
And then same deal with all the executive orders in this case, but with the strategic Bitcoin reserve, do I recall correctly that specifically it calls for buying $21 billion worth of Bitcoin?
At least 21 billion, with the goal of being the largest government holder of Bitcoin. I don't know if the final version is going to include that specific number or not. 21 is obviously a number that's important in the Bitcoin community and symbolic. The sort of ballpark we got here is we looked at the net position of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, because they hold all sorts of FX instruments now, and the language of the statute that creates the ESF says that you have to be beholden to whatever obligations to the IMF you have. And so the available funds that the ESF could use to buy Bitcoin are, I think, around 39 billion. And so we went with the mimetic number.
Do you think, in your opinion, right? So not as, head of policy at Bitcoin Policy Institute, in your opinion, do you think Ross will be free day?
You cut out there a little bit. It sounds like you asked if I think Ross will be free day one. Yes, I think so. I mean, this is something that Trump has said more than once, said very plainly. I don't know how much political capital it costs him to do it. I do think it will be confusing to a lot of people who are not libertarian or steeped in the early Bitcoin history, and so there will be some sort of education around why he made that choice. And there may be some pushback, but I don't know that Trump would have said that so specifically and directly if he wasn't going to.
Yeah, out of all of this, that seems the most likely expectation out of all the executive orders, all the things he can do in the first few weeks. Because also, like, for my opinion, I mean, first of all, he's not pardoning Ross; he's commuting his sentence, so it's basically time served. So, as you said, it doesn't really take much political capital, and obviously, it would just be a massive win, I think, for humanity, because Ross has served a significant amount of time for a nonviolent crime, so it'd be great to have him free. I'm quite looking forward to that, and it would probably be the single most. That would just be a massive disappointment, and I feel fucking horrible for Ross if after all this time that doesn't happen. So I expect to see that. In terms of this strategic Bitcoin reserve thing, and you could just tell me you're not going to answer it, but percentage-wise, what percent do you think the chances of him signing a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the first 3 weeks of his presidency?
Yeah, I don't think I'd want to put a specific percentage on that, other than to say, this is something that I think is being taken quite seriously, and both in terms of the executive order and in terms of the Cynthia Lummis Bitcoin Act. And I think there are a lot of people in the industry and a lot of people in the incoming administration who want to see a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And we're going to do our best. I think some of the challenge here is, especially on the legislative side, as opposed to the executive order, some of the challenge is what are the top crypto priorities, and we're a little bit competing for energy and space and political capital with stable coins and with legalizing VC token launches.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't care about either of those issues. Do you think I'm absolutely crazy if I think it's 90%?
I feel like I'm almost too close to this to be able to give a good answer. But look, I think in Congress, the main issue, like I said, is competing with other priorities. And look, the way it works with an incoming Congress, especially with a new president, is that you have 6 months or a year to really get stuff done. And then you have to start thinking about everyone's reelection, and there's just sort of less focus on legislative priorities. And so while this is going to be the most pro-Bitcoin Congress ever, I think there's no dispute about that. And there's a lot of interest across the industry from an SBR, not just from sort of pure Bitcoin only folks, but from the crypto community. I think people are broadly supportive. It's just going to be a race to see what gets done with regard to digital assets, and can we make the strategic Bitcoin reserve a top priority. The sort of piece of good news there is that at least on the Senate side, it looks like Senator Lummis is going to chair the digital asset subcommittee. I think that is a pretty good bet that we might get hearings on the SBR in the Senate. And so, hopeful that it happens. Even if it doesn't, I think there's a really good opportunity to move the Overton window and really start talking about Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. On the EO front, that's really anyone's guess. I don't want to say an exact percentage, but if you look at how Scott Bessent has talked about his view on monetary policy, and how we need to grow our way out of things, and how he sees the United States economy as sort of a geopolitical issue, I think the idea of an SBR aligns really well. It's public that he's met with Senator Lummis, I think specifically, and talked about the SBR. For those who want to sort of be wonky about this, I encourage you to read the BPI working paper by Matt Pines, specifically addressed and sent to Scott Bessent and his team, really, I think, forcefully making the case why at a geopolitical level this makes sense for the United States. So optimistic. I think the sort of betting odds now are about a third. If you really force me to, I'd probably say it's somewhere between that and 90%. It's a big range, but.
Yeah, I mean, when you say the betting odds like Polymarket or whatnot, I think that has it around 30, like mid 30s or something like that. Okay. We have about 15 minutes left here. I kind of want to move towards, and before we move, just real quick, when I'm thinking about these things, first of all, really the only person who knows whether or not these executive orders happen is Trump. And he could change his mind literally 10 minutes before he's planning on signing them. He's shown that that is the way he often operates. But I am quite optimistic. And I think what a lot of people do not realize is us in the Bitcoin community are focused on, maybe 5 to 10 executive orders, while Trump will likely sign over 1,000 executive orders in his first month of presidency. So it's really a small number amid a much larger slew of signed papers. But I want to move towards, so from your position, going forward over these next 2 years, what is your biggest concerns in terms of regulatory outlook, policy, and how that affects Bitcoiners?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. So my biggest downside concern is still the courts. I think that's an X factor. I think that is less relevant to this sort of friendly political moment for Bitcoin, and we could get really bad court rulings that hurt Bitcoin. Both from the existing Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet cases. There's a sort of recent thing that touches on the peer-to-peer issue around brokerage rules, and can sort of non-custodial software providers be brokers? And a judge coming out the wrong way on this stuff is always a threat, and may or may not be something that either the Congress or the administration can or would spend the political capital to overturn. So definitely something to keep an eye on. That's sort of the shark that's still out to sea. I think this is a real moment for Bitcoin to prove itself from a policy standpoint and the community. We're set up now better than we ever have been. I think we need to take advantage of this. I think if we fail to, that could be an issue. So everyone at BPI is working super hard. We're expanding a ton. I think it's public now. We're opening up a physical office in DC, partnering with PubKey for that, which should be pretty awesome. For those of you who are in DC, it's likely, I guess I shouldn't say the exact location, but it's going to be, if the current plans end up playing out, it's going to be an awesome location, and it's going to be something that'll be well worth the trek to track down to DC to visit this sort of Bitcoin embassy / bar / media space. It's going to be awesome. But I really think that we need to make absolutely the most advantage of this time that we can, and really interface with every part of government. Not just the Congress, not just the White House, but really all of the agencies, to make sure they understand Bitcoin and they're not making bad policy. And then I think there is, while I don't think that the government's embrace or adoption of Bitcoin is a threat to self-custody Bitcoin or Bitcoin as freedom money, I do think the financialization of Bitcoin kind of is a threat in that regard. With really easy options like the ETFs, people who are selling Bitcoin to own MicroStrategy, I think there's people can lose the plot about what the Bitcoin network is here for. And so, while I think that SBR is good policy, and good policy specifically for Bitcoin is freedom money, and not a threat to self-custody, I do think we need to be relentless in encouraging self-custody. And I think the people who are in the best position to drive that forward are the people who are building specifically Bitcoin companies, and making self-custody easier, more convenient, and more attractive than holding IBIT shares, right? So people who build, really good hardware wallets, people who build really good software wallets, people who are offering liquidity against self-custody Bitcoin, people who are offering insurance for self-custody Bitcoin. These are all really important if we're going to compete with, holding Bitcoin in your Schwab account or your Robinhood account. And so I'm hoping that both builders and VCs will really step up and use some of this good regulatory cover we have to build the tools that'll help Bitcoin serve that freedom money function.
Awesome. And going forward, there's a lot of people listening to this show right now, probably thinking to themselves, how can they best support the work at Bitcoin Policy Institute and the P2P Rights Fund? What is your answer to them?
Yeah, so both are 501c3 tax deductible nonprofits. So you can donate money for starters, either to BPI as a whole or the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund as a whole. And donating to the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund as a whole allows us to build up a war chest to support developers that are under threat. It allows us to provide regulatory resources to people who are building in the Bitcoin space and further this mission of building non-custodial tools. Or you could donate directly to the Samurai Wallet Defense Fund if that's your specific issue. Definitely just, we're going to try and sound the alarm when either something good or bad is coming down the pike, and really do a good job organizing people to call their representatives if, something comes up. So, following us on X, I'm sure we have various accounts on nostr, but keeping tabs and keeping informed is really important. And then later this year, we'll have the policy summit in DC, which will be a pretty awesome high signal event if folks want to come to that. I don't know if we've announced the date yet, but if you go to bitcoinpolicysummit.org, that's where we'll have information.
Awesome. Do Does the calling your local politician really, does that make a difference? I mean, I think it's almost kind of become a meme at this point.
No, I think it really does make a difference. Not that your local politician is going to listen in depth to what you say, but the way this works is lawmakers will have aides whose job, and it's calling specifically more than it's emailing. But if a bunch of people call about an issue, that is something that the lawmaker will hear from their staffers. And I think it's really as simple as, hey, we're considering this bill. We got 900 calls saying support the bill. We got 40 calls saying the bill is a bad idea. And, just in terms of allowing lawmakers to hear what the grassroots support for stuff is, that's really important. The biggest example that the industry has helped us on is with the infrastructure bill. I forget if it was 2021 or 2022, but where they were trying to add these terrible non-custodial broker rules that arguably applied to Bitcoin miners. People in the Senate heard enough from constituents that was bad, that was one of the things that pushed Ted Cruz to say, listen, none of you understand Bitcoin. Let's not make these rules that will dramatically hurt it. So yes, it's not how beautiful your letter is drafted or how eloquent the call is that you have with them, but the fact of your writing, or especially the fact of your calling, does actually make a difference.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to get disenfranchised by politics. I know I have historically been for quite a long time now, and I really do not trust any politicians. But one of the main advantages we have as a Bitcoin community is that we are a very strong grassroots-based community, and we can definitely leverage that and focus that in the right way. Before we wrap here, I just want to do a quick shout out to Dr. Jeff Ross, who's zapped 10,000 sats in the live chat. Thank you for supporting the show. Citadel Dispatch is completely funded by Bitcoin donations. We have no ads or sponsors. And in podcasting 2.0 apps like Fountain Podcasts, you can also support the show if you're not listening live. You can just download Fountain in your favorite app store. The largest zap we got for the last episode was Ride or Die Freak Ape Mithrandir with 17,777 sats. And he's recommending that everyone go back and listen to Citadel Dispatch episode 5 with Max Tannehill and Diverter. We talked about the dangers of KYC and tying Bitcoiners to our transaction history. If you're a new listener in general, you should consider going back to the entire back catalog of Citadel Dispatch. There's hours and hours of really great discussion that I think has aged quite well and is still quite helpful. Before we wrap here, Zach, first of all, I want to say I'm just incredibly proud of you. You've been absolutely crushing it. Thank you for fighting the hard battles out there and you're just constantly grinding. So I just want to say thank you in a big way, and that I'm very grateful to have you on Team Bitcoin. And then with all that said, what are your final thoughts for the freaks?
Yeah, thank you for that. My final thought is that, look, we are fighting one part of this fight. I think it is an important part. I think it's, what myself and the folks at Bitcoin Policy Institute are well situated to fight, which is advocating for Bitcoin policy with lawmakers and then, when necessary, in the courts. The truth is, if Bitcoin plays out over the long term, like it seems like it inevitably will, this is sort of a rearguard action. There are many ways where, like we talk about all the time, Bitcoin works well with American values. It's in the United States government's interest to have some and to have good policy with regard to Bitcoin. But there are aspects of Bitcoin that do take some power away from the state, right? Its monetary policy is not set by the Federal Reserve. It's set by code. You don't need permission to move Bitcoin. You don't need permission to mine Bitcoin, et cetera. And so there is, as important as this fight is, and I think it's important, and I encourage everyone to both support it. And if there are ways that we can help whatever you're building from a policy perspective, please reach out so we can be your advocate. In some sense, what we're doing is a rearguard action, right? It's to buy time for the builders, right? The most important people in the Bitcoin ecosystem, who are the people who run Bitcoin, who build stuff on Bitcoin, who make Bitcoin usable, to build the cypherpunk tools that make Bitcoin useful, permissionless money and make it into freedom money. And I also want to definitely shout out to all of the developers who are working, especially on non-custodial tech. The best thing we can do in terms of having good Bitcoin policy is to have good tech that the government will have to build policy around because it just exists. And that is the most powerful thing. And that's sort of the cypherpunk ethos of getting to good policy through just building rather than asking permission. So that's super important. And then also I want to give a shout out to the people at HRF who are taking the tech that exists there now and using Bitcoin directly as freedom money to help people who need it the most. So we want to be your advocates in Washington, D.C. Definitely don't be a stranger. Reach out to us, and we love your feedback. We love your donations, and please stay tuned when we need to mobilize you all to protect Bitcoiners from bad policy and to help create good policy. But important not to lose sight of what the Bitcoin network does and how important the people are who are actually building ways to leverage the Bitcoin network for good.
Awesome. Wonderful conversation, Zach. Thank you for joining us. Freaks, I have on Tuesday, I'm planning to have a wide-ranging conversation with Jack Dorsey. I do not know the time yet, but if you follow me on Nostr, primal.net/Odell, or you subscribe on YouTube, you'll be notified of the time ahead of time. Otherwise, you can listen to it in your favorite podcast app, as always, by searching Citadel Dispatch. I'm going to be trying to keep the momentum up here with Dispatch. Life has been quite busy lately, both on the professional and family side, which I'm quite grateful for. But it's really important to be able to connect with you guys directly and talk about these very important conversations. And with that, I love you all. Stay humble, stack sats.